The red and blue lights cut through the quiet street like a warning no one could ignore. It was just after dusk, that uneasy hour when the sky hasn't decided whether to hold on to daylight or surrender to night. The road was nearly empty. One car. One woman. One traffic stop that should have lasted less than a minute. The patrol cruiser rolled in behind her, lights flashing, engine idling with practiced authority. Inside the vehicle, the woman didn't panic. She slowed, signaled, and pulled over smoothly to the side of the road. Her movements were calm. Deliberate. Controlled. She had done nothing wrong. The officer stepped out slowly, adjusting his vest, hand resting casually near his belt. His posture carried familiarity, the confidence of someone used to being obeyed without question. He approached the driver's side, flashlight sweeping across the interior, lingering just a little too long on her face. "License and registration," he said. Flat. Mechanical. She reached for her purse without hesitation, careful not to move too fast. Her hands were steady. When she handed him her identification, he barely glanced at it before letting out a short, amused breath. "This yours?" he asked. "Yes," she replied calmly. He looked again, this time longer. His expression shifted, not to concern, but to disbelief. Then a faint smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth. "You expect me to believe this?" he asked. The woman didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue. She simply met his eyes. "Yes," she said. "Because it is." The officer leaned back slightly, as if amused by a private joke. His tone changed, not aggressive yet, but dismissive. Condescending. "You don't look like a federal judge," he said. The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. She didn't flinch. Didn't correct him. Didn't defend herself. She had learned long ago that sometimes silence speaks louder than protest. She waited, eyes steady, posture calm, hands still visible on the steering wheel. Behind them, another car slowed to watch. Then another. A phone camera flicked on somewhere down the street. The officer chuckled softly, shaking his head as if entertained by his own conclusion. "You know, impersonating a federal official is a serious offense, right?" She took a slow breath. "I'm aware." That answer seemed to irritate him more than anything else. His voice hardened. "Step out of the vehicle." She did. The air was cool now, tension thick enough to feel. As she stepped onto the pavement, the officer's tone grew louder, performative, confident, designed to assert control. Every movement was exaggerated. Every word carried the assumption that he was in charge, that whatever story this woman was telling would collapse the moment he applied pressure. But she didn't resist. Didn't plead. Didn't explain. She stood there quietly as he called her information into dispatch, his voice loud enough for bystanders to hear. "Yeah, I've got a female here claiming to be a federal judge," he said, pausing as if to enjoy the absurdity. "License checks out, but I'm not buying it." A car slowed to a stop across the street. Someone lifted a phone higher. Another person whispered, sensing something was off. The woman looked straight ahead, jaw set, eyes calm, not with arrogance, but with restraint. The kind of restraint built from years inside rooms where power was wielded with precision, not volume. The officer paced. Tapped his pen against his notepad. Smirked again. "People like you think flashing a title gets you special treatment," he said. "That's not how it works out here." She finally spoke, her voice low and measured. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she said. "I'm asking you to do your job." The words landed clean. Sharp. Unemotional. Something shifted. The officer's smile thinned. His posture stiffened. The moment stretched longer than it should have. Then his radio crackled. He looked down at it. Listened, and for the first time since the stop began, the confidence in his expression wavered, just slightly. The woman remained still, her eyes forward, her composure unbroken. The night had not yet revealed what it was about to expose, and the man holding the badge had no idea that the power dynamic he thought he controlled was already beginning to collapse. The radio crackled again, louder this time, cutting through the thin layer of confidence the officer had been wearing like armor. He turned his shoulder slightly, angling away from the woman as if the transmission were private, but the street was too quiet, the night too still, and the tension too thick for anything to go unnoticed. "Repeat that," he said into the mic, his tone sharp now. A brief pause followed. "The kind that stretches longer than it should. Long enough for doubt to creep in. Long enough for the woman to notice his jaw tighten." She stood where he'd told her to stand, hands visible, posture straight. She didn't watch him. She didn't watch the crowd gathering at the edge of the sidewalk either. Her gaze remained forward, composed, practiced, the posture of someone accustomed to scrutiny, not threatened by it. The officer cleared his throat and glanced back at her. His confidence hadn't vanished, but it had shifted. It was no longer smooth. Now it was brittle. "You said your name was," he started, then stopped himself. He looked back down at the device in his hand as if hoping the information would rearrange itself into something more convenient. A car pulled up behind the cruiser and slowed, the driver rolling the window down just enough to watch. Another phone appeared, then another. No one spoke, but the air felt charged, like a courtroom right before a verdict. The officer turned back toward her, voice sharper, louder, more performative than before. "So you expect me to believe that you just happen to be a federal judge driving around alone at night, and somehow no one knows who you are?" She met his eyes calmly. "I don't need anyone to know who I am," she said. "I need you to follow procedure." That sentence landed harder than any accusation could have. His jaw clenched. He took a step closer, too close, invading her space under the pretense of authority. His voice lowered, meant only for her, but the tension made it carry. "Don't play games with me," he said. "You're already pushing your luck." She didn't move. Didn't raise her voice. Didn't step back. "Officer," she replied evenly, "I'm not the one escalating this." For a moment, it looked like he might respond with anger. His shoulders lifted. His grip tightened around his radio. The familiar instinct to assert control rose in him, the reflex of someone used to dominance, not challenge. Then the radio spoke again. This time, the voice on the other end was clearer. Firmer. "Unit 317, confirm subject's name and date of birth." The officer hesitated. A beat too long that he read the information again, slower now. His eyes flicked back to her face, then down at the screen. The shift in his expression was subtle, but undeniable. The first crack in the wall, the crowd noticed too. A whisper rippled through the small gathering. "What's going on?" someone murmured. The officer took a step back, creating distance where moments earlier he had demanded dominance. His tone softened, almost involuntarily. "Ma'am, can you confirm your middle initial for me?" She did. Another pause. The radio crackled once more, and this time the voice on the other end carried weight. Not confusion, not curiosity, but certainty. There was a name. A title. A designation that didn't belong to someone standing on the side of the road being questioned. The officer's face drained of color that he swallowed. The air seemed to thicken, pressing down on him as the reality of the situation began to form. He shifted his stance, suddenly aware of how many eyes were watching, not just the bystanders, but the invisible ones too. The cameras. The systems. The records that never forget. That he glanced around, as if searching for an exit that didn't exist. The woman said nothing. She didn't need to. Her silence now carried authority. The officer cleared his throat, straightened his vest, and spoke again, but the edge was gone. "Ma'am, I just need to verify a few things." She nodded once. "Take your time," she said calmly. "Accuracy matters." That sentence landed heavier than any accusation ever could. Behind them, a car door opened and closed. Another unit had arrived. The second officer stepped out, slower, more cautious, eyes scanning the scene before settling on the woman, then back to his partner. There was a brief exchange of looks, a silent conversation filled with questions neither wanted to ask out loud. The first officer shifted uncomfortably. "Everything okay?" the second officer asked. The first didn't answer right away. That he looked at the woman again. This time, his gaze held something new, not suspicion, not arrogance, but recognition, and something close to fear. The crowd leaned in closer, sensing the change. Phones were raised higher now. Whispers grew louder. whatever this stop had been at the beginning, it was no longer routine. The balance of power was tilting, slowly, unmistakably, away from the man who thought he controlled it, and the night was just beginning to show him exactly what that meant. The second officer stepped closer, his boots scraping softly against the asphalt. He glanced from his partner to the woman, then to the small cluster of onlookers gathering at a cautious distance. His posture was guarded now, shoulders slightly squared, eyes alert, the posture of someone stepping into a situation already spiraling beyond control. "What's going on?" he asked, voice low. The first officer hesitated. "Just a fraction of a second. Long enough to reveal uncertainty. She's refusing to cooperate," he said finally. "Claims she's someone she's not." The woman turned her head slowly toward him. Not sharply. Not angrily. Just enough to let him see her expression clearly. "That's not accurate," she said evenly. "I've complied with every lawful request you've made." The second officer looked between them, then down at the notepad in his hand. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in the information already written there. "License came back clean?" he asked. "Yes," the first officer replied, a little too quickly. "And registration?" "Valid." There was a pause. "And the issue is?" the second officer pressed. The first officer exhaled through his nose, irritation creeping into his voice. "She's claiming to be a federal judge." The second officer looked at the woman again, this time longer. Not dismissive. Assessing. "And is that true?" he asked her directly. She met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes." The silence that followed felt heavier than before. Not hostile. Not yet. But charged with the kind of tension that comes when authority is forced to confront itself. The first officer shifted his weight. His patience was thinning, his composure beginning to fracture. He stepped forward again, reclaiming the space he felt slipping from him. "Listen," he said, voice louder now, sharp enough to cut. "You can keep this up all night, or you can be honest. You don't look like a federal judge. You don't act like one. And right now, you're obstructing an investigation." That was the moment the line was crossed. The woman's eyes hardened, not with anger, but with resolve. When she spoke, her voice remained calm, measured, unshaken. "I haven't obstructed anything," she said. "I've answered your questions. I've followed every instruction. And I've remained respectful despite your assumptions." A few murmurs rose from the onlookers. Someone whispered, "She's right." Another voice shushed them. The second officer shifted his stance, uncomfortable now. He glanced toward the cruiser, toward the dash camera blinking silently, recording every second. The first officer noticed. His jaw tightened. "You know what?" he snapped. "Step back toward the vehicle. Hands where I can see them." The words hit the air hard. The woman didn't move. "I am already complying," she replied. "There is no legal reason for you to escalate this." The tension snapped like a wire pulled too tight. "I'm giving you a lawful order," the officer said sharply. "Last warning." Behind him, the second officer stiffened. His eyes flicked to the woman, then back to his partner, uncertainty written across his face. The crowd had grown now, not large, but enough. Phones were no longer hidden. Several were held openly, recording. The atmosphere shifted from curiosity to concern. The woman inhaled slowly. When she spoke, her voice was calm, deliberate, and unmistakably firm. "Officer," she said, "I am advising you to reconsider your actions." The words weren't loud. They weren't threatening, but they carried weight. The first officer scoffed. "Is that a threat?" "No," she replied. "It's a warning." The second officer's expression changed. His eyes widened slightly, as if a realization had finally broken through. He stepped closer to his partner, lowering his voice. "Hey, maybe we should just," but the first officer cut him off. "No," he said sharply. "She doesn't get to talk her way out of this." He reached toward his cuffs. The moment froze, time seemed to stretch, the air tightening around them. The woman remained still, composed, her hands visible, her posture unchanged. Her calm now stood in stark contrast to the escalating aggression in front of her. "Officer," she said quietly, "if you place me in cuffs without cause, you will regret it." The words were not a threat. They were a statement of fact. The second officer's face drained of color. "Wait," he said urgently, placing a hand on his partner's arm. "Just wait." The first officer froze, his hand inches from the cuffs. "What?" he snapped. I think we need to confirm something before this goes any further." The woman exhaled slowly, as if releasing tension she had been holding since the moment the lights flashed behind her. "Please do," she said. The second officer stepped back, lifting his radio with a shaking hand. His voice dropped, respectful now, almost cautious. "Dispatch," he said, "can you confirm the subject's credentials again?" "Full verification." There was a pause. A long one. The night seemed to hold its breath. The crowd leaned in. The camera lenses didn't blink, and then the radio crackled to life, clearer than before, unmistakable in its authority. The voice on the other end spoke a title. A real one. A powerful one. And in that instant, everything changed. The first officer's face went pale, his grip on the cuffs loosened, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. The power he had wielded so confidently just minutes earlier evaporated, leaving behind something raw and unmistakable: fear, because in that moment, he realized the truth. This wasn't a misunderstanding, this was a career-defining mistake, and the consequences were no longer hypothetical. The name came through the radio clearly this time, slow, deliberate, unmistakable. The second officer stiffened the moment he heard it. His eyes widened, then darted instinctively toward the woman standing only a few feet away. The color drained from his face so fast it looked as if someone had pulled the ground out from under him. The first officer didn't speak. He couldn't. The radio crackled again, confirming the title attached to the name. Federal. Appointed. Active. Verified. A silence followed, the kind that presses against the ears, heavy and absolute. The woman remained still. She didn't smile. She didn't straighten her posture in triumph. She simply stood there, hands still visible, face calm, eyes steady. The power she carried now wasn't something she wielded. It was something that existed whether she acknowledged it or not. The first officer swallowed hard. He looked at the second officer, searching for something: denial, reassurance, an alternate explanation. He found none. The second officer gave a slow, almost imperceptible shake of his head. This can't be right," the first officer muttered. The second officer didn't respond. He didn't need to. The radio had already done the talking. The woman broke the silence. "I told you who I was," she said quietly. "You chose not to believe me." Her tone wasn't accusatory. It wasn't angry. It was factual. Final. The first officer stepped back, suddenly aware of the space between them, of how small that space now felt. His posture shifted, shoulders slumping slightly as the reality of the situation settled in. He stopped himself, cleared his throat. "I apologize if there's been a misunderstanding." The words sounded rehearsed. "Inadequate, a misunderstanding," she repeated softly. "Is that what you think this was?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. The weight of the moment pressed down on him, forcing him to confront something he had likely never had to face before: accountability. Behind them, phones were still recording. A quiet murmur rippled through the small crowd, not excitement, but recognition. People knew what they were witnessing. Not just an argument. Not just a mistake. A reckoning. The second officer stepped forward, his tone careful, respectful. "Ma'am, we sincerely apologize for the inconvenience. There appears to have been a miscommunication." The woman turned to him. Her expression softened slightly, not forgiving, but measured. "An inconvenience is a delayed meeting," she said. "What just happened was a misuse of authority." The words landed with precision. She looked back at the first officer, who now avoided her gaze. "You questioned my identity without cause," she continued. "You implied criminal intent without evidence. And you attempted to detain me without lawful justification." Each sentence struck like a gavel. The first officer's breathing grew shallow. His earlier confidence had vanished completely, replaced by something raw and exposed. I didn't mean, he began. She raised a hand, not sharply, not aggressively, just enough to stop him. This is no longer about intent, she said. It's about conduct. The silence that followed felt heavy with consequence. A car drove past slowly, the driver craning their neck to see. Somewhere behind the scene, someone whispered, "That's a judge." The second officer shifted his stance again, visibly uncomfortable. He glanced toward the cruiser, then back at the woman. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "how would you like to proceed?" The question hung in the air, loaded with meaning. It wasn't a formality. It was an acknowledgement, a quiet transfer of control. The woman took a slow breath. She looked around, the bystanders, the officers, the flashing lights still casting red and blue shadows across the pavement. Then she looked back at the man who had stopped her. "For now," she said, "I'd like my identification returned." The first officer fumbled slightly as he retrieved it, his hands no longer steady. He handed it back with both hands, eyes lowered. "Thank you," she said, accepting it without ceremony. He nodded, unable to meet her gaze. She paused, then added, "And I expect a full report of this stop to be filed, accurately." "Yes, ma'am," he said immediately. The shift was complete. Where once he had stood with authority, he now stood in compliance. Where his voice had been sharp, it was now careful. Controlled. The second officer exhaled quietly, relief mixed with dread. He knew what came next. Internal reviews. Statements. Questions that would stretch far beyond this roadside. The woman turned slightly, addressing both officers now. "I will be documenting this encounter," she said. "As will others." Her eyes flicked briefly toward the phone still recording. "I trust that all body cameras are active." Both officers nodded, almost in unison. "Good," she said. For a moment, no one spoke. The flashing lights continued their silent rhythm, illuminating the scene in alternating red and blue, a visual reminder of authority, now stripped of its illusion. Finally, the woman stepped back toward her vehicle. The first officer hesitated, then stepped aside to give her space. The gesture was small, but its meaning was unmistakable. As she reached for her door, she paused and looked back at him one last time. "This didn't have to happen," she said calmly. "But now that it has, it will be addressed." She opened her door. The second officer swallowed hard. The first officer stood frozen, watching her return to her car, not in defeat, but in dignity. The engine started, the door closed, and as she pulled away, leaving the flashing lights behind, the weight of what had just occurred settled fully onto the shoulders of the man who had believed himself untouchable, because now, the power he had misused was about to turn inward. And it would not be merciful. The silence that followed her departure felt heavier than the confrontation itself. The street, moments ago alive with tension, now seemed hollow. The flashing lights continued their mechanical rhythm, but the authority they once projected had drained away. The second officer stood motionless for a moment, staring at the empty stretch of road where the woman's car had disappeared. Then he exhaled, slowly, deliberately, and turned toward his partner. "You need to call this in," he said quietly. The first officer didn't respond right away. His jaw was clenched so tight it trembled. He stared at the ground as if answers might be written in the asphalt. "I know," he muttered, but he didn't move. The second officer waited a beat, then spoke again, firmer this time. "Now." That did it. The first officer reached for his radio with a heaviness that hadn't been there before. Every movement felt weighted, deliberate, the physical manifestation of consequence beginning to settle in. "Dispatch," he said, voice low. "We need to file an incident report. Full details." There was a pause on the line. Then a response came back, professional but unmistakably alert. "Copy that. Supervisory review will be initiated." The words landed like a final verdict. The second officer closed his eyes briefly. He knew what that meant. Everyone did. Within minutes, another set of headlights appeared at the end of the street. Then another. And another. A supervisor arrived first, composed, expression unreadable. He listened quietly as the situation was summarized, eyes moving between the officers, the dash cameras, and the bystanders still recording. No one raised their voice. No one needed to, the facts were already forming a narrative far more damning than any argument. Is the footage secured? The supervisor asked. Yes, sir, the second officer replied. Body cams and dash cams are all active. The supervisor nodded once. Good. He turned to the first officer. Walk me through it, he said. The officer hesitated, then began. His words came out stiff, uneven, missing pieces he couldn't quite bring himself to include. He spoke of the stop, the identification, the questions asked. He avoided the tone. The assumptions. The moment where judgment had replaced procedure. The supervisor listened without interruption. When the officer finished, the supervisor waited a few seconds longer than necessary before responding. You understand, he said evenly, that this will be reviewed in full. Yes, sir. And you understand that misrepresentation, bias, or deviation from protocol carries consequences. The officer nodded. His face was pale now. The supervisor turned to the second officer. Your statement? The second officer straightened. I'll submit a full report, he said. Accurate and complete. Good. A short distance away, the small group of onlookers lingered. Some whispered. Others watched silently. Phones remained raised, recording every movement, every word. The story was already spreading, quietly at first, then with growing momentum. The supervisor stepped aside and made a call. His tone was clipped, professional. Yes. Yes, confirmed. Federal Judiciary. Understood. He hung up and turned back toward the officers. This incident will be escalated, he said plainly. Internal affairs will take lead. Until then, you're relieved from duty. The words hit with finality. The first officer's breath caught in his throat. Effective immediately, the supervisor added. There was no shouting. No dramatic confrontation. Just the quiet collapse of authority under its own weight. The officer slowly reached up and removed his badge. For a brief moment, he held it in his hand, staring at the metal surface that had once defined his identity. Then he handed it over. The supervisor accepted it without ceremony. The second officer looked away, his expression a mixture of relief and unease. Around them, phones continued recording, not with excitement now, but with a sense of witnessing something sobering. This wasn't spectacle. It was accountability unfolding in real time. Within hours, the footage would spread. Edited clips would circulate. Headlines would form. Statements would be drafted. Investigations would open, but in that moment, none of that had happened yet. All that existed was the quiet aftermath of power misused, and corrected. The supervisor gestured toward the patrol car. You're done for the night, he said to the first officer. He nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the ground, and walked toward the vehicle that had once symbolized his authority. Now it felt like a reminder of what he had lost. The second officer remained standing, uncertain, watching his partner disappear from view. The supervisor turned to him. You did the right thing, he said quietly. The second officer nodded, though his face showed the weight of what he'd witnessed. I should have stepped in sooner. The supervisor met his gaze. Next time, you will. The patrol cars began to disperse, one by one, their lights fading into the night. The street returned to stillness, but the consequences were only beginning, because beyond the flashing lights and quiet roads, paperwork was being filed. Statements were being reviewed. Cameras were being analyzed frame by frame, and somewhere, in an office far removed from the street, the woman who had been stopped was already preparing what came next. Not revenge, accountability, and the system that had failed her was about to feel the full weight of its own rules. The following days moved quietly, but with purpose. No sirens. No flashing lights. Just paperwork, phone calls, and closed-door meetings that carried far more weight than any public spectacle ever could. The incident itself had already begun to ripple outward, slipping through internal channels, reviewed by people whose job it was to notice patterns, not excuses. The body camera footage was logged, catalogued, and replayed in sterile conference rooms. Frame by frame. Word by word. Analysts paused at moments others might have dismissed, the tone of voice, the posture, the timing of decisions. The pause before compliance. The hesitation before authority was challenged. What stood out wasn't a single mistake. It was a sequence. A pattern, and patterns, once documented, demanded answers. The internal review board convened within 48 hours. No press. No cameras. Just a long table, a row of files, and the quiet weight of institutional accountability. The incident wasn't treated as an isolated error, it was examined as part of something larger. Had similar complaints been filed before? Had corrective training been recommended and ignored? Had warning signs been minimized because nothing serious had happened before? Each question tightened the frame around the truth. The officer at the center of the incident was formally notified of the investigation. His badge remained confiscated. His duties suspended pending review. He was instructed not to contact witnesses, not to comment publicly, and not to interfere in any way. He complied, outwardly calm, inwardly unraveling, because for the first time in his career, the authority he'd relied on offered no protection. Meanwhile, the second officer's statement was reviewed line by line. His cooperation was noted. His hesitation, documented. His late intervention, questioned. He was called in for additional interviews, not as punishment, but as part of a process designed to understand how hesitation can enable harm. The message was subtle but clear: silence carries weight too. Beyond the department, the incident began to move through other channels. Legal analysts reviewed the stop for constitutional violations. Civil rights offices examined the footage. Oversight committees flagged the case for monitoring. It wasn't loud. It wasn't immediate, but it was thorough. Meanwhile, the woman at the center of it all continued her work, quietly, methodically. She didn't give interviews. She didn't issue statements. She let the process unfold exactly as it should. When colleagues asked how she was handling it, she answered simply, "I trust the system to reveal the truth." And for once, the system seemed determined to do exactly that. A preliminary report was drafted. Language was precise. Clinical. It avoided emotion but carried unmistakable conclusions: procedural failure, bias indicators, improper escalation, violation of conduct. Each line added weight to the outcome that was quietly taking shape. Internally, policy memos circulated. Training modules were flagged for review. Supervisors were instructed to re-emphasize de-escalation protocols and bias recognition. What had begun as one roadside stop was now forcing an institution to look inward. Outside, public awareness grew, not from outrage, but from documentation. Clips shared online weren't sensationalized. They were measured. Contextual. They showed exactly what had happened, without commentary, and that made them harder to dismiss. Community leaders took notice. Legal analysts weighed in. Not to inflame, but to explain. "This is what accountability looks like," one said during a panel discussion. Not outrage. Not spectacle. Process. The officer at the center of it all received formal notice days later. Pending review, his employment was under suspension. Mandatory retraining was ordered. Further disciplinary action would follow the findings of the oversight board. He read the notice alone. There was no anger this time. No denial. Just the quiet understanding that his actions, once dismissed as routine, had been measured against standards he could no longer avoid, and they had fallen short. Across the city, policy revisions were already being drafted. Body camera protocols tightened. Language guidelines updated. Supervisory response timelines shortened, not because of public pressure, but because the evidence demanded it. The system, slow as it was, had begun to correct itself, and at the center of it all stood a simple truth: accountability didn't arrive through confrontation. It arrived through exposure, and it stayed through structure. The process wasn't over. It never really was, but the shift had begun. The street where it all began returned to normal within days. Cars passed without slowing. Pedestrians crossed without looking twice. The curb where the patrol car once sat held no trace of what had happened there. No markers, no signs, no reminder of the tension that had filled the air. But the absence of evidence did not mean the absence of impact. Inside courtrooms, offices, and training rooms, the ripple continued. The woman at the center of it all resumed her work quietly. She didn't give interviews. She didn't seek attention. When colleagues asked how she felt about everything that had unfolded, she offered only a measured response. "It's not about me," she said. "It's about what happens when power is questioned, and whether the system listens." And this time, it had. The officer who once stood so confidently behind flashing lights now faced a long period of reckoning. Not humiliation. Not public shaming. But accountability, the kind that forces reflection, correction, and, if necessary, consequence. Training sessions were restructured. Supervisors were required to review real footage, not hypotheticals. Language around routine stops and officer discretion was scrutinized, refined, clarified. The message was clear without ever being shouted: authority is not immunity. Across departments, quiet conversations began to shift. Officers talked, not defensively, but thoughtfully, about judgment, restraint, and responsibility. Younger recruits listened closely. Veterans paid more attention than they let on, because everyone had seen the footage. They had seen how easily confidence can turn into assumption, how quickly authority can become entitlement, and how fast the balance of power can change when accountability enters the room. For the public, the moment lingered not as outrage, but as recognition that it reminded people that justice does not always arrive in dramatic fashion. Sometimes it arrives calmly, through documentation, through patience, through the slow, unglamorous work of insisting on fairness. The woman never sought to be a symbol, but she became one anyway, not because she raised her voice, not because she demanded retribution, but because she stood still when it would have been easier to react, because she trusted process over impulse. Because she understood that true authority does not need to announce itself, and in doing so, she exposed a truth many had felt but rarely seen proven. Power is not proven by how loudly it is asserted, but by how carefully it is restrained. In the weeks that followed, the case continued its course through official channels. Reports were finalized. Policies revised. Training schedules updated. There were no victory speeches, no viral statements, just quiet progress, and that, perhaps, was the most powerful outcome of all, because justice does not always arrive with sirens or headlines. Sometimes, it arrives with documentation, due process, and the quiet understanding that accountability, when enforced, can change behavior far beyond a single moment. The road where it began returned to stillness, but the system it touched would never be quite the same. And for those watching, for those who had ever wondered whether calm dignity could stand against misuse of power, the answer was now clear. Yes, it can, and when it does, it changes everything.